Now on C-SPAN 3, the House Armed Services Committee will have a chance to weigh in on the same matter. The waiver only approved one time for George Marshall, who President Harry Truman appointed as Defense Secretary in 1947. Again, this is live coverage of the House Armed Services Committee on C-SPAN 3.
Committee will come to order. Today we have, at this portion, 3 items of official business to consider: adoption of the rules, the security procedures, and the appointment of committee staff. Before we do that, let me just take a brief moment and welcome returning and new members to the committee, and also express some condolences to those members who are here with us for a day and are being forced to leave us after this. The truth is, this is a special committee. Most people believe that it's the president or the military's job to decide how big the military ought to be and what weapons they ought to have and so forth. If you look at Article 1, Section 8, It says it's Congress's responsibility to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a Navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces of the United States. That puts a responsibility on our shoulders, and it's a significant responsibility because, as we all know, men and women volunteer to serve our nation and defend us and put their lives at stake. But they're counting on us. The rest of the story is, for 55 straight years, Congresses with majorities from both parties and presidents of both parties have found a way to come together and pass a national defense authorization bill. 55 straight years. Now, there have been some hiccups along the way. It hadn't always been easy. But that bipartisan tradition of coming together for the men and women who serve, for the security of our nation, is also something, I think, that weighs on us and our responsibilities. This year, we've got to exercise those responsibilities in a world that's growing more dangerous and more complex. We're going to work hard. We're going to have lots of sessions of various kinds, but I am very excited about the tremendous breadth and depth of talent on both sides of the aisle that this committee has, and I very much look forward to working with each of you and the contributions that each of you will make to our product this year. Let me yield to the distinguished ranking member for any comments he makes before we move on to the rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would merely echo your comments. I think you described the job on this committee very well. It is a great committee. I've been privileged to serve on it for 20 years under a number of different chairs of both parties. I think the fact that we work together in a bipartisan way to produce a very important product every year makes this committee, frankly, unique in the House at this point. And I've enjoyed working with you, respect the way you run the committee, and I look forward to an interesting year. We have a lot to do, to be sure, but as you said, we have very, very talented members of this committee, and I guess the only thing I would add, which I know you've said many times as well, we also have an incredibly talented staff that does an enormous amount of work and makes this possible, so I thank them as well, and look forward to working with all of you in the year ahead. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let me go ahead and call up Committee Resolution Number 1 regarding the committee rules for the 115th Congress. The clerk will read the resolution. Read the resolution.
Committee Resolution Number 1, resolved that the Committee on Armed Services, U.S. House of Representatives, adopt the committee rules for the 115th Congress, which are stated in the copy distributed to each member.
The proposed committee rules have been developed jointly with the ranking member and made available to members' offices earlier this week. Following consultation with Mr. Smith, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be considered as read and the resolution be open to amendment at any point. Without objection, it is so ordered. Let me just say that the committee rules and the security procedures are largely unchanged from the 114th Congress, with one notable exception. In Rule 4 of the committee rules, the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities has been given jurisdiction over the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which was formerly under the jurisdiction of the Subcommittee on Strategic Forces. That program, when it began, focused on nuclear proliferation. It has shifted its focus to chemical and biological weapons and counterterrorism. That obviously fits better with the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats. Thus, the rules make that change. Otherwise, they are both substantially similar to what we had before. Is there any further discussion, questions regarding the committee rules? Are there any amendments related for the committee rules? If not, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, for the purpose of offering a motion regarding Committee Resolution Number 1, the committee rules.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt Committee Resolution Number 1 concerning the committee rules.
Question occurs on the motion offered by the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson. So many in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. A quorum being present, the motion is adopted, and without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Next order of business is Committee Resolution Number 2 regarding the committee's security procedures for the 115th Congress. I call up Committee Resolution Number 2 and ask the clerk to read the resolution.
Committee Resolution Number 2, resolved that the Committee on Armed Services, U.S. House of Representatives, adopt the committee's security procedures for the 115th Congress, a copy of which has been distributed to each member.
The security procedures were again coordinated with the ranking member and made available to members' offices on Tuesday, January 10th. I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be considered read and open for amendment at any point without objection. As I said, this is basically the same we had last year. Is there any further discussion of the security procedures? Are there any amendments to the security procedures? If not, Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt Committee Resolution Number 2, the security procedures for the 115th Congress.
Question now occurs on the motion of the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson. So, members in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A quorum being present, the motion is adopted, and without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Finally, I call up Committee Resolution Number 3, appointing committee staff for the 115th Congress. The clerk will read the resolution.
Committee Resolution Number 3, resolved that the persons listed on the sheet distributed to the members and such other personnel as may be required by the committee within the limits and terms authorized under the rules of the House of Representatives are hereby appointed to the staff of the Committee on Armed Services, U.S. House of Representatives, for the 115th Congress, it being understood that according to the provisions of law, the chairman will fix the basic salary per annum.
As many of you know, our committee is unique in that the committee staff is integrated. They are all here to provide advice and counsel to each of you, Republican and Democratic members alike, and I suggest that you take advantage of their talents and expertise. I hate to talk about them because most of them are in the room, but as Mr. Smith said, it's a pretty outstanding group. A copy of the committee staff for the 115th Congress was prepared in consultation with the ranking member and made available to members' offices on Tuesday, January 10th. I ask unanimous consent the resolution be considered as read without objection. Is there any further discussion about the committee staff? If not, Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina for the purposes of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt Committee Resolution Number 3 regarding committee staffing for the 115th Congress.
Question now occurs on the motion of the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson. So, members in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. A quorum being present, the motion is adopted, and without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Without objection, committee staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to reflect the action of the committee in adopting committee resolutions 1, 2, and 3. And if the ranking member has no further comments at this point, the committee stands adjourned for this business portion. Let me switch notebooks. Committee will come to order. The committee now meets to consider H.R. 393, granting a one-time exception to Section 113A of Title 10 U.S. Code, which limits those who can serve as Secretary of Defense to those who have not served in the military within the past 7 years. I have to confess that these are circumstances which I did not expect us to face. When General James Mattis was named by the President-elect as his nominee for Secretary of Defense, I could not have been more pleased. As I said publicly and privately to members of this committee, I believe civilian control of the military is an important principle of our government. And I also believe that this is an extraordinary situation and an extraordinary individual, the combination of which warrants a one-time exception to the law. As returning members will remember, we had two committee roundtable discussions in December, one with a briefing by our committee staff to go through the law and the precedent when Congress granted an exception to General George C. Marshall to serve as Secretary of Defense in 1950. The other roundtable was with respected outside experts who discussed civilian control of the military and the other issues that arise by this exception. My intention, as I made clear to the committee and to the transition team in December and since, was to have General Mattis come testify before us on his views on civilian control of the military before we vote on the exception resolution. And let me be clear, General Mattis was willing and eager to do so. I talked to him personally. He gladly agreed to come and answer our questions about the waiver or about other topics that we might have. Obviously, members know that he has testified before our committee many times in a variety of capacities. On Tuesday night of this week, however, I was informed that the President-elect's transition team would not allow General Mattis to testify after all. I think that's a mistake. There are major principles of government involved with this exception, which has been requested for the first time in 67 years. I have complete confidence that General Mattis would have answered our questions in a way that only increased the confidence in the wisdom of his selection. I think it would have added strength to his position and gotten the partnership between him and our committee off to a good start, and he recognized those advantages immediately. Unfortunately, short-sightedness prevailed. Nonetheless, we are where we are. The top priorities for this committee have always been the national security of the United States and support for the men and women who serve her. With that as our guide, I believe we should approve the exception today that allows General Mattis to serve as Secretary of Defense so that there is no gap in that important office and so that the nation can benefit, once again, from the service of this extraordinary leader, thinker, and public servant. I'd yield to the ranking member for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I too am very disappointed with where we're at on this for a number of reasons, which I'd like to get into. I do want to say right up front that Mr. Thornberry, the chairman, and I spoke from the moment this started, and we're on the exact same page, that we wanted General Mattis before us. I also spoke with General Mattis on the phone. He was eager to testify, eager to answer our questions, and it was this was listed as a hearing that was going to have him testify 2 days ago. And then at the last second, President-elect Trump decided not to allow him to do that. And I think that is a large mistake, and it basically takes this committee completely out of the process. In fact, for reasons that I'll state in a moment, there's really no point in us even having the discussion we're about to have with the bill that is in front of us. And this is something that we've battled over for a long time, the executive branch, usurping the authority of the legislative branch. Now, obviously, for the last 8 years, it's been Republicans usually making that charge at a Democratic president. And here we are at the very start or even before the start of a Republican administration. And that's exactly what they're doing. They are making our committee irrelevant to this process. And civilian control of the military is enormously important. I think it would be incredibly important to hear from General Mattis, for all of the members to hear from him directly on that point. And the fact that he is not is going to make me personally oppose this change in the law. And I want to make that clear. This is not a waiver. It's been commonly called that. There is no provision in the law for a waiver. There is a law that was passed in 1950 and then amended slightly, I think, in 2008 to go from 10 years to 7 years that says that basically if you have not been out of the military for longer than 7 years, you cannot serve as Secretary of Defense. And what that means is that right now, as the law currently stands, it is against the law for General Mattis to be the Secretary of Defense. So in order to fix that, we don't have to give him a waiver. We have to change the law. And when you change a law, if you're doing it right, it goes through committee, through the House and through the Senate. And the Armed Services Committee is the committee that passed this law back in 1950 and amended it in 2008. We should have a say in that, and we don't. And the reason I say that this is irrelevant is because the bill that we are supposedly marking up today, House Resolution 3, sorry, I don't have my glasses on, 83, 93, whatever it is, this bill is going nowhere. This bill is dead. The bill that we are going to hear on the floor tomorrow is the Senate bill. So it makes no difference whatsoever whether or not we pass this bill, don't pass this bill, whatever. This bill isn't going anywhere. The Rules Committee is going to meet about 1 o'clock in the morning or something to discuss the Senate bill. So what we're doing here is literally a waste of our time because this bill doesn't mean anything. We're just going to catch the Senate bill on the fly, put it on the floor, have the debate there, and send it out. So what has happened is, in a critically important matter, who is going to be the Secretary of Defense and civilian control of the military, the incoming president's team has decided that the House Armed Services Committee is irrelevant. Now, what I think we should do is say, that's not acceptable. We will not change the law for you until General Mattis appears before us. Now, I take the chairman's point that, we want to have the Secretary of Defense in as soon as is, conceivably possible. But I get the sneaking suspicion, since there's really no reason whatsoever for General Mattis not to testify, and most Republicans I've talked to have agreed with me, he can more than handle himself. He's done it many times before. I think all of a sudden they'd change their mind and he'd be available, and we'd get that opportunity. By not doing that, by saying, yeah, okay, we are irrelevant, we agree, we are abdicating our authority on this committee, and I think that is an enormous mistake. And the final point I want to make is the reason that we go through the legislative process that we go through is to make sure that pieces of legislation are as good as they possibly can be. And there's actually a couple of problems with the Senate bill. And I think the thing that we have in front of us is the exact same language as the Senate bill. Again, not that that matters since this bill isn't going anywhere. But the Senate bill, the way it is written, is different than the one that was written for General Marshall in 1950 in two ways, one of which I think is really important, the other which is potentially important. The first one is this bill does not name General Mattis as the one-time exception to this law. It is an unnamed person. Now, I believe it is also written in such a way that they only get one person. So it's not like this means that if 4 years from now or 3 years from now President Trump wants to name somebody else, he can do it without respect to this law. But it does mean if for some reason General Mattis winds up not being confirmed, not being the Secretary of Defense, that President-elect Trump could pick somebody else who violates this law, and we wouldn't have any say in that either. I think we should, in this piece of legislation, say quite clearly, we are changing this law for General Mattis and for General Mattis only. Because if we don't know who else might come along, and we don't know what their views would be on civilian control of the military or anything else for that matter. But second, and more problematic, also in 1950 for General Marshall, and this is something I didn't know, but if you serve in the military and retire, so you do your 20 years, and I believe this is just for general officers, you are, for the rest of your life, as long as you are receiving that pension, and you're legally required to receive that pension, you are subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And the Uniform Code of Military Justice is slightly different than your average criminal law. That means that General Mattis, while he is Secretary of Defense, while he is supposed to be a civilian, is going to be subject to military law. Now, I realize that that's highly unlikely to happen, but in theory, President Trump could court-martial him if he did something in violation of the UCMJ. And that's why the separation of the military from the civilian is so important. And that's why in 1950, they made sure that General Marshall was exempt from the similar requirements. It wasn't the UCMJ back then. They also, as I understand it, when Omar Bradley took over the Veterans Administration, did the same thing for him to make sure that he was a civilian. Now, if we were doing this properly, we could offer an amendment, and we could change that. We wouldn't just have to take the Senate's language and swallow it. But since we're not doing this properly, we can't. Well, we could offer an amendment, and we could change this bill, but this bill isn't going anywhere. The Senate bill will be the bill that controls it. So by abdicating our authority, I think we've made a huge mistake. The executive branch is going to, have a whole lot of opportunities to figure out how much they want to inform us. And I want to say that I have been consistent. Even during the Obama administration, I have spoken out when they ignored the authority of this committee, most notably when the exchange for Bo Bergdahl was done and they released 5 prisoners, and we had a requirement in law that they were supposed to notify us 30 days before, and they didn't. I spoke out very strongly against President Obama ignoring the authority of this committee. So, it's not just about, for me anyway, what party the person happens to be in. It's about the authority of this committee, and we're abdicating it. Now, the only way we can change that is tomorrow on the floor to vote down the Senate bill and say, no, the Armed Services Committee of the House matters every little bit as much as the Armed Services Committee of the Senate, and we should have our say. And by not doing that, we are not living up to a lot of what was said at the start of this hearing about exerting the authority of this committee. As the chairman said so eloquently, it's not the president, alone who runs the military. We have a say in it as well, except not today. Today we've decided to just let it go and have no say in what I think is a pretty important issue when it comes to the national security of this country and the men and women who serve. So I would urge you to reject this bill that we have before us today, except that would be kind of redundant because this bill has already been rejected. It's been rejected by the House Republican leadership. It's been rejected by the House Republican caucus. This bill isn't going anywhere. The Senate bill on the floor tomorrow is what we'll debate. So this bill is dead, whether you vote for it or not. But I would urge, that we reconsider letting the president-elect and the Senate simply roll over us and take away our authority. And with that, I yield back.
I don't want to argue with all the points that Mr. Smith made. Many of the things he said I agree with. I do think because we have a number of new members, a further word of explanation is required, and obviously Ms. Smith will have the chance to respond in any way he sees fit. The House bill that we are marking up today, the Senate bill, which is supposed to be voted on the Senate floor right now, are exactly the same words. Those words came about because they were depicted in the continuing resolution that passed last December. The CR that most people in the room voted for, and I've got the exact list of who did, the CR prescribed exactly the words that have to be in this resolution in order to be privileged in the Senate. So that's the reason that H.R. 393, the bill that the Senate is voting on the floor, are exactly the same words and should not be amended. If it is amended, then it loses its privileged status in the Senate. I think we probably will vote on the S bill tomorrow. That's because the Senate's ahead of us. They're voting on the floor right now to pass it, and therefore we can take what they have already passed tomorrow and have it available for the President-elect to sign on January 20th. I just want to emphasize, I think a lot of the points Mr. Smith makes about how it should have been written differently are valid. I would have written it differently. But the reason it is before us in the form it is because that's exactly the language that is law right now in the CR that most people voted for. Had one other point I was going to make, and I forgot what it was. So, do you have anything else you'd like to? Before proceeding further, let me make a couple of announcements. First, if there are any amendments, they must be in writing, and 80 copies must be available at the desk for distribution. Secondly, it's the chair's intention to operate under the 5-minute rule in order to allow all interested members to speak in an orderly manner. Without objection, all members have 5 legislative days with which within which to submit written statements for the record. So ordered. Without objection, Mr. Smith and I have agreed to postpone any recorded votes on any amendments until the end of consideration of amendments. I call up now H.R. 393, a bill to make the bill was made available and distributed to members' offices on Tuesday. Without objection, we'll dispense with the first reading of the bill. Is there any further discussion of the bill? Gentlelady from California. For 5 minutes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding the briefing that we did on civilian control of the military before the break. I agree with you. It was very insightful. It was very informative. And during that briefing, all the witnesses agreed that a hearing with General Mattis was necessary to discuss the concerns of this committee surrounding the legislation that we're considering today. I want to say to all the members here, I greatly appreciate your remarks. I think you've been put in a difficult and an unnecessary position. After 7 decades and only one occasion when the Congress felt it was necessary to waive this important protection on civilian control of the military, I urge my Republican colleagues to take the responsibilities of this committee seriously. Without a hearing, we can't really satisfactorily ensure that for the American people, that General Mattis will be able to adapt to the new requirements necessary for a Secretary of Defense and different from a senior military leader. How can we ensure that he will provide the appropriate counsel and, if necessary, resist the wishes of the President in the best interest of the defense of our nation and the preservation of peace to the greatest extent possible? I had certainly thought of a number of questions right on this topic that I wanted to ask him. Furthermore, the nameless language in the bill sets a dangerous precedent, and it opens the gate for subsequent nominations and confirmations of recently retired service members. This was not the case in 1950, when the waiver clearly, or the law, clearly applied to General Marshall and no one else. The language stipulated that, I'll quote, "No additional appointments of military men to that office shall be approved," unquote. The legislation has several other fundamental flaws that the ranking chair has raised. In addition, the future rights of the House Armed Services Committee in this matter are truly at stake. To accept without making the appropriate changes, without participating in the process at all, we are doing nothing to safeguard civilian control of our military, and we are setting the stage for an expedited and similar process for the future. So should we rush so willingly to throw away something we have held dear as Americans for so long? Reading the impassioned transcript of the executive session of this committee in 1950, there was talk of a crisis. The nation had just entered the Korean War. A sitting president was asking the Congress to act quickly to confirm and grant an exception to law for a well-known general of the Army who already served as the Secretary of State. So with that in mind, I have to ask us today, knowing that this is a critical time, especially challenging time for all of us, is it, though, an immediate crisis? Are we in the same place we were as a country in 1950? What troubles me the most is that General Mattis had willingly agreed to speak before this committee in the People's House. But it is my understanding that the presidential transition team blocked him from appearing today. I don't think the American people care what the transition team thinks and would much rather hear from the nominee himself on why we in the House should grant this exception to law. Although we are required to make these laws, we are casting off our duty, agreeing to be irrelevant. So, Mr. Chairman, as I stated during our briefing in December quite clearly, we need to speak to General Mattis before I will vote to approve this action today, and therefore I cannot do that. I yield the remainder of my time.
Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, again, I want to basically associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Smith and Ms. Davis. But I would like to, again, just make one point that I think a lot of us who are struggling with this vote today want to make clear, which is that none of our criticism of this bill is aimed or intended to really be aimed at all at General Mattis himself. Again, as has been stated, he has been a frequent flyer at this committee, has testified a number of times, and I think is just an incredibly impressive individual who, if you watched his appearance at the Senate Armed Services Committee today, once again demonstrated really the, I think, very balanced, reasonable approach that he takes to a whole variety of issues in terms of use of military force, his, again, abhorrence of torture as any kind of sanctioned policy of this government. And again, I think really would be an incredibly effective Secretary of Defense. But as John Adams, a fellow New Englander, once said, we are a country of laws, not of men and women. And this really is an issue of civilian control, which I regard, and I think a lot of us do, as really one of the crown jewels of our nation, which is that the control of decisions of war-making and military force really has to rest within the civilian leadership of this country. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 enshrines that concept in terms of giving and vesting within the Congress war-making powers. Very frankly, we're in a context right now where this institution has not really held up its side of things in terms of asserting that authority. We are now today, again, with about 15,000 troops in harm's way overseas in the Middle East who are operating under an authorization of use of force that goes back 15 years ago. It's been estimated that roughly 70% of the Congress that was seated at that time is no longer here. And obviously the threat that they are dealing with is something that no one in their wildest imaginations could have estimated or figured was going to be facing this country in 2017. In 2015, President Obama actually came forward with a proposal to amend and modify that use of force, in other words, inviting the Congress to step up and engage in terms of its civilian role. And unfortunately, in the last Congress, we didn't even have hearings, let alone a vote, in terms of trying to modify and adjust what was a proper authorization of force given the threat that our men and women in uniform are facing over there. And it is important to note that our military leadership, whether it was General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or General Mattis himself, testified before Congress that they would encourage us to step up and set that policy, that in fact it was good for the people who were at the front lines in terms of giving them the confidence to know that the American people were behind them and understood what the challenge that they were contending with in places like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And by the way, General Mattis reinforced that opinion earlier today, that in fact he invited civilian control to be exerted to a much greater degree than is the case today. And again, really is I think a very disturbing trend that we had some opportunity today to turn around and to exercise by having a meaningful public hearing process and a markup, which unfortunately is not going to be the case. So again, I think for a lot of us, this is a very awkward and difficult situation because of our high regard for General Mattis, but the fact of the matter is the principle that's involved, a constitutional principle that really goes to the essential DNA and fabric of this country, is something that we really just cannot overlook and treat as a mere technicality, and for that reason I will oppose this bill. I yield back.
Again, I just want to say I agree with many of the comments gentlemen from Connecticut made on authorization of use of force. It is not within the jurisdiction of this committee, however, to pass out such an authorization. One other point, and I feel like I'm given too much of a history lesson here, but there is one precedent for this, and that, as you've heard, is in 1950. Let me just give you the timeline of what happened in 1950. On Wednesday, September 13th, President Truman requested that Congress change the law so General Marshall could serve. That's Wednesday. On Friday, the House Armed Services Committee met in executive session. General Marshall was never a witness, met in executive session, passed out the legislation providing the exception. Both the House and the Senate passed it the same day. Friday, 2 days after President Truman asked for it, both committees had passed it out and both chambers had passed it. General Marshall was not a witness at either of them. President Truman signed the legislation on Monday. The next day, Tuesday, the Senate held a confirmation hearing for General Marshall, where he did show up and he did testify. The Senate voted on the Marshall confirmation then the next day, Wednesday, and so by Thursday, basically 1 week after the request was made, he was on the job on September the 21st. I take back nothing that I said about General Mattis should have been allowed to testify. I just want those who are concerned about the executive, legislative, and precedent to know that the only precedent in this case is that General Marshall did not testify before either the House or the Senate before the waiver was passed and signed into law. Only then did he testify at a confirmation hearing. Ms. Bardillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to briefly state my serious concerns with moving forward on this legislation without the committee having the opportunity to hold a hearing with General Mattis. While the Senate is tasked with advice and consent of nominations, the House does have a unique responsibility to weigh in on tremendously consequential legislation, and we are being relieved of this today. We have heard for years about how the executive branch has ignored the will of the legislature branch, and yet when Congress has a chance to exercise its authority, we are instead expected to be rubber stamps to an incoming administration that continues to show no indications that it will respect the critical traditions and prerogatives of our body. Mr. Chairman, I understand that you worked hard to secure an appearance from General Mattis and even received a commitment to appear prior to our consideration of this bill, and I do want to go on record saying that I appreciate that. I am disappointed, however, that the new administration has reversed course and ignored the wishes of our committee. I have stated previously that I believe the experience and the critical thinking ability that General Mattis brings to the table is very important to an administration that sorely needs that capability. This is not a vote on his nomination. This is a vote based on whether we believe we should waive a 70-year-old law that codified principles by our founding fathers. And furthermore, Mr. Chairman, it is a vote on whether we believe General Mattis, or whoever may be confirmed by the Senate for this post, will protect civilian control of the military and how that individual will actively support this critical institution. But we have been denied the opportunity to ask questions of General Mattis and really dig into the importance of this matter. And because we did not have our rightful opportunity to ask substantive questions of the General, I do not see how I can support this legislation without directly undermining this committee and this House. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and I yield back.
Mr. BYRNE.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The ranking member alluded to the potential for a Rules Committee meeting at 1 o'clock tomorrow morning. I have tremendous respect for the gentleman from Washington, but as a member of the Rules Committee, I thought I could inform this committee that the Rules Committee will start meeting at 3:30 this afternoon on another matter. It's anticipated that the Senate bill will come over to the Rules Committee while the Rules Committee is in the throes of that particular hearing. It is important to the Rules Committee, I think I can say this on behalf of Chairman Sessions and all the members, that we hear from the Committee of Jurisdiction. And because the Senate bill and the bill before this committee at this point in time are identical, then the vote of this committee is very important to us, and I think would very much inform the decision of the Rules Committee whether or not to make this bill or the Senate bill in order and how we would make it in order. So I appreciate the fact that it's being done this way, and I don't think it's going to be done in the dead of night. I intend to vote for this bill in this committee, again in the Rules Committee, and again tomorrow afternoon. Ms. Cheney and I may be the only people in here who get to vote on this 3 times. And why would I do that? Because on January the 20th, the men and women in uniform of the United States need a Secretary of Defense. I don't think that there's that much, if any, opposition to the particular person who's involved here. I hear nothing but the greatest of praise for General Mattis from people on both sides of the aisle. I understand the objections that have been stated. This is not the ideal way to do this, but I'm thinking first and foremost about those men and women that wear our uniform. And for them, I intend to vote for this bill 3 times to make sure they have the right person as their Secretary of Defense on January 20th. And I yield back.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by saying how extremely dismayed I am that we're not provided the opportunity to consider the policy legislating on this matter at hand. And I want to associate myself with the comments of Mr. Smith and my other colleagues on this topic. And Mr. Chairman, I understand what a difficult position you are in, and I appreciate the comments and reflected your frustration on this issue as well. And like others have said, I want to say that nothing in terms of our concerns expressed about this bill itself reflect on General Mattis or his qualifications. That being said, while I appreciate General Mattis' decades of distinguished service to our nation, I also believe that the preservation of civilian control of the military must be one of our highest priorities, and that the House Armed Services Committee should in fact, play an integral role in determining the status of any waiver granted to a Secretary of Defense nominee. So our military must defend our society rather than define it. And I worry that this waiver, approved without a hearing, may increase the civilian-military divide that we're seeing today. So, Mr. Chairman, this is no way to do business. And our concerns regarding civilian control of our military are not trivial. Nor was the previously scheduled hearing set to be a divisive event in any way. We are not the Senate, and we did not seek to confirm General Mattis. However, the incoming administration was provided an opportunity to begin its relationship with our members on the right foot by engaging with us through an open hearing into civilian control of the military. In that endeavor, they have certainly failed. So by circumventing the appropriate processes and by discounting the influence of this committee, I am consequently less inclined to support this waiver. Were General Mattis to have appeared before us today, it would have allowed history to show that this change to the law was in fact warranted. I would have asked him about his strategic use and views of civilian expertise within the department, within the State Department during conflict negotiations, ways in which he plans to combat civilian-military divide as a recently retired general officer, and how he views any politicization of the department as a general officer serving a political institution. So these questions, as well as those of my colleagues here today, are valuable. They are warranted and deserve answers directly from the nominee seeking a waiver from this committee. So, Mr. Chairman, his failure to appear before us today does not reflect favorably on the behavior necessary to preserve civilian control of the military, and I find this all deeply troubling. So I yield back.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the sometimes great pleasures and sometimes one of the most esoteric conversations I have with my sons is that I let them know that in this job every day we get to struggle with what the Constitution means and what it compels us to do. Sometimes to them it's a very boring conversation, but it is very true that one of the privileges of this job is that we actually have to try to embody what the words of the Constitution mean, and we struggle with that every day. And a few of those words are down in front of us, and the chairman mentioned those as part of the organizational hearing, Article 1, Section 8. And that is really the civilian control of the military. We have that job to organize the department. And it's this issue of the civilian and military relationship and civilian control of which we're speaking, and it is no small issue that we discuss today because it is one of those struggles about the question, one of the questions within the words of the Constitution. And so this act of changing the law I believe it is an act of civilian control of organizing the Pentagon, and that's namely, of course, this appointment of the next Secretary of Defense. But, this hearing is about that, and it's not about the merits of the Secretary-designate Mattis. I can make a case for him, distinguished military career. The greatest thing about him, he's from the great state of Washington. And that's very irrelevant to the question that we face today. To paraphrase the chairman, we're dealing with principles of government for the first time in 67 years with regards to this question. I just wanted a simple hearing to hear the Secretary-designate, his views on civilian control of the military. And why is that? Because we haven't done this for 67 years. When you do something so rarely, surely you can spend a mere moment of those 67 years to find out what the views are of the person that you're planning to put in a position of Secretary of Defense, especially one coming out of the military, especially one coming out of the military within that time frame that the existing law sets. To hear from that one person who can help us, this committee, create the record to which we can hold that secretary accountable. This oversight is no small issue. This committee oversight is no small issue. And I think we are, frankly, not starting off on the right foot when it comes to oversight. And so as a result, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your willingness to, even though it's in the rules, still your willingness to allow us to express our views. I will be voting no, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Ms. Tsongas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share your disappointment that General Mattis was prevented from appearing before this body today, and I appreciate very much your strong statement to that effect. Like many here, I watched General Mattis in the Senate this morning, and I appreciate his knowledgeable and forthcoming testimony. But it is not a reasonable substitute for his timely appearance before this committee. The deeply American principle of civilian control of the military is an organizing tenet of our government, and is why, by law, a commissioned military officer is prohibited from being appointed as Secretary of Defense without having at least 7 years of relief from active duty. This reflects a fundamental principle of the American Republic that decisions relating to raising and organizing our armed forces and to war and peace itself should rest in the hands of the representatives of the people, our civilian leadership. This bedrock belief is one that I have come to really appreciate as I have served in Congress. The unique circumstances of General Mattis's nomination necessitates the law before us today, and it is the responsibility of the Congress, the House included, to determine whether or not it is within the national interest to suspend a prohibition whose purpose is to ensure that the Secretary of Defense retains no allegiance or preference to any particular military service, that he or she is able to approach decisions on the use of military force on the basis of overall national interest and not just military assessments, and that the Secretary derives his or her power from the will of the people, not the loyalty of members of the armed forces. Historically, the size of our armed forces has grown and diminished with war and peace. Today, however, we live in the era of an all-volunteer force comprised of a permanent standing military. With this in mind, I believe that ensuring that our military remains a highly professional, nonpartisan institution is vital and demands that we closely scrutinize anything that could jeopardize its neutrality. Only one waiver has been granted since the inception of the Department of Defense, which was approved by Congress under very different circumstances. The Korean War effort was faltering as the department itself was struggling to stand up. Importantly, that waiver authorized General Marshall to take the office by name, and I continue to have reservations about the lack of specificity in the waiver request before us today. I will be opposing the legislation under consideration today for several reasons, none of which have to do with the merits of General Mattis, who esteems service to this country is not in question. I believe that this committee should have had the opportunity to better understand how the General intends to safeguard the value of civilian control of the military in light of his very recent service. I am deeply disappointed and concerned that his time with us was canceled by the Trump transition team, preventing us from exercising our authority and responsibility on behalf of the American people. I also have strong reservations regarding the language of the bill that is likely to come over from the Senate tomorrow. One major shortcoming, again, is that the bill fails to designate General Mattis by name. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will not support the legislation under consideration today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's been quite interesting being a Marine and an infantry Marine having to debate this issue, not just with my fellow colleagues, but among the many Marines that have contacted me through Facebook in some very colorful language. But it does show, Marines are Marines, but it does show that, you know, this general has a great following. He is well respected. I respect him. I wish that he would be here, not because I wanted to take part in the advice and consent clause that the Senate should be doing, but to actually talk about historically what are we actually doing. I fear not General Mattis. I fear the generals 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when this is another waiver that comes in, whether it's a general that just barely left military service, and 20, 30 years from now, much like we were doing in HASC, we start looking at the record and we start trying to decide and decipher what those members of Congress were saying and thinking. Like, let's be clear about one thing. When General Marshall was given this waiver, there was a lot of debate around this. And it was a debate among mostly men who, a vast majority of them had just finished serving in World War II. They had vast respect for General Marshall. They had a very intimate understanding of the military. And even then, those members of Congress were saying that this might be a bridge too far. And so for us to sit here and say that what we're doing is not necessarily significant, I think is incorrect. We are significant in the timeline of history when it comes to setting precedents in this Armed Services Committee and in Congress. So, you know, I will be voting no, and I encourage people to vote no, because we need to make sure that we're establishing the historical argument and reinforcing the historical argument for civilian control of our military. This is not a vote against General Mattis. This is a vote for us, if you vote no, for us to continue to support the idea of civilian control of the military, which has been enshrined since the founding of this country. And I think it's important that we have perspective about what we're about to do. And, you know, had General Mattis been here, my questions would have been just directly at that. Not his qualifications, because I think they are impeachable. You cannot even question that, nor his positions. I think that is the job of the Senate. My only role, my only scope, my only lane here was to talk about the historical context of what happens when you give a waiver such as this and what it means to overall our democracy and the tradition of civilian control of the military. And with that, I yield back my time.
Related to the gentleman's comments, let me just make sure everybody knows this committee will prepare a report based on our action today, and all members will have the opportunity to include additional or dissenting views in that report. If one goes back and reads the report from 1950 executive session, it's very interesting. And I don't know that it's always puts, as you look at that debate, I don't know that it always puts them all in a light, but it is interesting, as General points out, history is being made. My point is everybody will have a chance to contribute to that history. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the legislation, keeping in mind that I equally support and respect the principle of civilian-military relationship. This is from the perspective for me as the very grateful son of a flying tiger who served in China during World War II, 31-year veteran myself of the Army Reserve, Army National Guard, but particularly as a grateful dad of 4 sons who have served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Egypt. Based on the extraordinary background of General Mattis and his testimony today earlier in the Senate, I believe that a waiver should be appropriate. My first choice, indeed, was to support the chairman, that we would have had efforts for the general to appear before the committee today. But I believe that it is so crucial that we need to expedite believing in General Mattis, that we know he'll continue the great tradition of supporting civil-military relationship. And the confirmation is crucial for continuity for our nation's missions to protect American families and our allies to promote world peace. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. McEachin from Virginia, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, let me start off by thanking you for your efforts to get the good general to come to this committee. Mr. Chairman, I share many of the concerns that my colleagues have already expressed. All of us were elected to do a job, but today the incoming administration is asking us to abdicate our responsibilities as representatives and as citizens. The supremacy of civilian authority is a cornerstone of our democracy. The measure before us requires careful thought and reasoned debate. We cannot do our jobs, we cannot have an informed discussion, nor have confidence that we will reach the right conclusion if the general does not appear before the full committee. Unlike many of you, I've never had the privilege of meeting the general. I've never had the privilege of looking in his eyes, judging his sincerity, and making sure that he understands the gravity upon which we hold the principle of civilian authority, and to make sure that he understands the actions that are being asked for us to perform. We need the opportunity to ask these questions, to hear his answers, and to weigh his views. For years, I've observed the majority talk about holding the administration accountable. They've called for tougher oversight, closer scrutiny, harder questions. Now, at the very first opportunity, they've chosen to roll over and give the incoming administration exactly what they're asking for: no oversight, no scrutiny, no hard questions. I've heard many good things about the good general, and I wish he were here today to speak with us. But since he is not, I have to exercise my best judgment, and that is to vote against the resolution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working with you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Chairman. I've sat here listening to much of the conversation and respect it. A lot of it's repetitive from a process standpoint. Nothing I've heard so far says that the Commander-in-Chief will not be the President of the United States. So the ultimate civilian leadership rests with the Commander-in-Chief, and he then hires someone with the advice and consent of the Senate to be the Secretary of Defense. I don't know what's magic about 7 years. I've heard nothing during this process conversation that says anyone needs a 7-year detox program to shed themselves of all the vices and nasty stuff that you get by serving in military. We've got a general officer sitting on the front row. We've got a colonel sitting on the second row, and no one would remotely suggest that they're more loyal to the military than they're loyal to the constituents they represent back home. So why is 5 years not an appropriate detox program? Why is 3 years not necessary? Now, clearly, no one in here is going to put a uniformed officer currently in service in that position. You're not going to do that. So as we move along that line of how long they've been out, I've not heard any kind of psychology or scientific evidence to say 7 years is something magic. Mr. Mattis has been out over 4 years, and so I'm quite comfortable saying that he's going to be more respectful of the civilian that he approaches that job with than his previous service as a military man. And the conversation, the debate has been high-minded and respectful, and I understand that, but this is going to be a party line vote. And you're going to send the next Secretary of Defense into his role to lead every man and woman in uniform with a split vote between the majority and the minority. And that does not send a very good message. I can assure you, those young buck sergeants and E4s, E3s out there that are going to be asked to follow the instructions of the civilian leadership would be much more impressed if it was a unanimous vote for Mr. Mattis. And so however you couch your language, I'm voting for Mr. Mattis to be Secretary of Defense today. My vote on this bill will be for Mr. Mattis to be Secretary of Defense. The process, I got it. You can make those arguments, and you've done that very, very well. I respect that. But for me and my vote, it's to vote for Mr. Mattis to be the Secretary of Defense. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like you, I also believe strongly that the founders had it right when they established laws to maintain civilian control over the government and armed forces. And like you, I was excited to hear about President-elect Trump's choice to nominate General Mattis for Secretary of Defense. He's a man of exemplary experience who has the strength to guide our nation's military at a time when we face new and dynamic threats at home and around the world. And it's because of this reputation that I was likely to support a waiver for General Mattis so that he could become our next Secretary of Defense. But President-elect Trump has refused to make him available for the hearing so we can hear from him directly about why we should provide that waiver. And the action before us doesn't even specify that it's General Mattis who will get the waiver. Yeah, I think we can all agree that with much of what our colleagues have said, but the refusal to allow him to testify despite his willingness to do so is a thumb in the nose to the House of Representatives, to this House Armed Services Committee, and to the chairman. We deserve better. Chairman Thornberry deserves better. And I have to say, on my last, I think this will be my last day on the committee, Mr. Chairman, if you can hear me from down here, I would say I think you've been an exemplary and fair chairman. You've set a standard for professionalism and bipartisanship in Congress. It's been an honor to serve with you. And I think you deserve the respect from the incoming administration to have General Mattis come testify. It looks, on the other hand, like we're going to abandon our responsibility to weigh and to limit the terms of a waiver and to give President-elect Trump assurance that he doesn't have to worry. What will be getting me? He doesn't have to worry about the House of Representatives. Our response to him saying he's not going to send someone down here, which seems petulant to me, is to say, okay, that's fine. And I think that's the wrong way to start off, whether you're Republican or Democrat. And like I said, if I were to continue on this committee, from what I know, I'd be very likely to support the waiver if he were to come here. But it's wrong for us as a committee to abdicate our responsibility in this matter. Pursuant to our constitutional duty, we should stand up without regard for party. We should demand that we be allowed to hear from General Mattis, and we should provide our constitutional check on the executive branch. Maintaining these checks and balances is how we keep tyranny from walking in the front door. It's our job. We have to do our job under the Constitution, and we're making excuses for not doing our job today. The quality of the candidate is not an excuse. And so I think we should hold the administration accountable to bring General Mattis before us, allow him to appear pursuant to his wishes. And until he does so, I would not support the waiver, and I urge my colleagues to join me. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your service to the country. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 1935, General George Marshall wrote to a colleague, and I quote, "The great man is he who makes the minor adjustments without dishonor that permit the great issues or important matters to be carried to proper completion," unquote. This quote perfectly sums up today's hearing, and I'm afraid it's not a very flattering one on the actions that this committee is poised to take. It shows that General Marshall, who was the last and only nominated Secretary of Defense to be allowed a waiver, would not have approved of the committee's actions here today. This legislation needs not so minor adjustments in order to be carried to proper completion. And I fear we are all courting dishonor because of the refusal to make these changes. I speak, of course, of the two major problems with H.R. 393 that we have been discussing here today. The waiver must be amended so that it applies only to General Mattis. Otherwise, it becomes a blanket waiver for any nominee who meets the conditions, and that's unacceptable. And it must waive the Uniform Code of Military Justice for General Mattis specifically, so that he cannot be brought before a court-martial for laws that civilians are not subject to, it is critical that the Secretary of Defense be a civilian, subject solely to the civilian rules of law. As it stands, this legislation creates a permanent imbalance between the civilian and military leadership roles in the Department of Defense and flies in the face of a core principle of our democracy, which requires civilian control of our military and government. As another general and president once warned us, quote, "We must guard against unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist," unquote. This is less about General Mattis, who is and has indicated that he's inclined to come and appear. It is more about non-elected Trump transition staff and about a fear I have that the President-elect views the executive branch not as a separate and co-equal branch, but as a superior branch. We shall not be rolled over by the executive branch in our responsibilities as a separate and equal branch of government. Mr. Chairman, I applaud your leadership and your intellect, and I regret that I must join my colleagues in respectfully voting against this waiver, and I yield back.
Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been interesting to hear some of the constitutional arguments today, but there's nothing in the Constitution that speaks to civilian control of the military, that the President has to, in a certain fashion or manner, appoint a Secretary of War, or as we call it today, a Secretary of Defense. You'll find nothing in Article 1, nothing in Article 2. There's no amendment. In 1947, there was the National Defense Act that was established, and it did lay out the guidelines that needed a waiver with General Marshall. So we often speak that he was the only exception of having a uniformed member in a short time span take over the leadership of the Department of Defense. That's simply not historically accurate. In fact, if you go back in our history, when they were called Secretaries of War, there were many that served in a much shorter time span from the time they left uniform to the time they took control as Mr. rather than General. What is it that the objectors are truly afraid of? Do they truly want to say something but are unwilling to say it? We hear the bland words civilian control of the military as if somehow those American citizens that have borne the brunt of service or battle are somehow no longer entitled to their citizenship and are forever imprinted with some mark of Cain. What are the real objections? Do the objectors instead wish they could say, we are afraid of the warrior class? We are afraid that they might cause a war? Is that it? Historically, American battle-hardened warriors have promoted peace far more than their non-serving counterparts. They understand the human suffering on a grand scale, the chaos of destroyed communities, loss of order, no public services, and death by weapons, disease, or hopelessness is a reality. It's not academic. They also understand that we need to do anything we can to prevent such things. The greatest saber rattling often seems to occur from bloviating politicians that have never borne the sword. Do the objectors also wish to say we're afraid that they might take over the government? I don't know. Historically, if there was ever an opportunity for that concern, it was in the 1790s. President George Washington, a general, had commanded at the highest level of our nation and was revered. He appointed to Secretary of War, what we call Secretary of Defense today, men like Henry Knox, a general, Timothy Pickering, a general, James McHenry, a military surgeon. In his Treasury Department, he appointed Alexander Hamilton, a major general, and Oliver Wolcott, a general. For the equally important post of AG, he appointed men like Edmund Randolph, a general, and William Bradford, a colonel. If there ever was a nascent time and country with military leaders in charge that had the most at stake and generals in the most important post, it was then. Instead, General Washington relinquished the most powerful position in the land and peacefully transitioned government and refused a third presidential term, something that many of the opponents cannot say with their own party. And instead, what we see is a peaceful transition of government led by example. He set the example. We should have expected no less from General Washington, for he, like all the other warriors, truly understood what it meant to serve the country. If you look at our own secretaries of state, historically, nearly 1/3 had military service, with no less than 10 obtaining senior rank. Notable men like Edmund Randolph, Timothy Pickering, James Monroe, James Buchanan, Lewis Cass, George Marshall, Dean Acheson, Dean Rusk, Henry Kissinger, Cyrus Vance, George Shultz, James Baker, Alexander Haig, Warren Christopher, and Colin Powell remind us that military leaders have often made the most competent leaders of our foreign policy. Why no such concerns there about military takeover of diplomacy? One could argue that it's almost as if America seems to have a phobia of civilian control of diplomacy. Their achievements were so notable, we often forget that they even served in the military at all. General Mattis is a warrior. He will put the national security and peace of the United States above all other concerns and will uphold and defend the Constitution. He will do it with humility, distinction, honor, and continued selfless service. He needs to be wavered and confirmed immediately for the good of our warriors that serve and defend us at night and for the good of the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Chairman yields back. I'm certainly not going to cut anybody off. I just want members to know that in roughly 30 minutes, we're going to have about an hour's worth of votes on the floor, and we just want to keep that in mind. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With great respect to my colleague and the recent comments that he's made, this is in no way demeaning or in any other way putting down or saying anything negative about the extraordinary military and members of this committee and others past who served in many different positions. This is really about the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, which says it is the Congress that has ultimate control. There should be no doubt in our minds here that General Mattis is an extraordinary individual and will undoubtedly serve, just as the gentleman said, with distinction and honor. However, there should also be no doubt in our mind that this is the first instance in this new Congress and soon with the new administration of the ongoing power struggle between the Congress and the administration. We've seen this in the past when the Congress of the United States in the last Congress did not take up its responsibility to issue a declaration of war, or as we now call it, an authorization to use military force. The Senate did. The House of Representatives did not. We abdicated the most important power that we possess. And in fact, this committee exists for one reason, and that's to carry out the constitutional responsibility given to it in Article 1, Section 8. We're about to lose the very first power struggle, traditional down through history, between the administrative branch and the Congress. The chairman and the ranking member correctly asked that General Mattis appear before this committee. He agreed to do so, but he was told not to appear. You can take a look at this any way you want to, but this is the first of what will be many issues that will face this committee and this Congress about our role as given to us in the Constitution. It was read to us at the outset of this hearing. The civilian control of the military is fundamental. General Washington gave up his commission to become president, and indeed he did bring into positions, as we have historically, military men and women who have performed with exceptional grace, dignity, and worthiness. However, this is about why this committee exists at all. And for us to allow a nascent administration, not yet in power, to deny us the opportunity to hear from the next Secretary of Defense is not in our long-term and even short-term interests. Two major issues have been raised about the way in which the current legislation is written, both important. It's open-ended. I mean, we may not like a person who would come next. And the issue of the military code of justice is profoundly important. We ought to address those. And my good colleague from at the other end of this row could take up this matter in Rules Committee and allow us to amend the legislation on the floor. If we were to do that, then the Senate would be in a bind, wouldn't it? They might actually have to have 60 votes to pass the legislation, but it's because they want to avoid that we are now denied the opportunity to amend the bill in a way that it really should be done. But the Rules Committee could give us that opportunity. We're going to take this up. Hopefully we'll do what is right along the way here. But I just want to remind us that this is the first of many incidents. And the previous Congress and the previous Congress before that waived the most fundamental of our obligations. I hope we do not begin this Congress in the same way, but I fear that we're about to. For all these reasons, I intend to vote no.
Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging my friend Mr. Conaway's comments. In fact, in our closed-door roundtable, numerous reasons were given for why this time period, originally 10 years, but now 7 years, exists in the law. And just as one example, in a department sometimes known or infamous for its inter-service rivalries, one concern is that recently retired members of the military will have a particular allegiance to their particular service. Now, as a Marine veteran myself, it's hard to imagine a retired Marine general having any particular allegiance to the Marines. But perhaps, Mr. Chairman, that's just because my own detox is going well. Mr. Chairman, it is a true honor to serve on this committee. I'm so proud, as an American and as a Marine veteran, to serve here and to serve under you. You are someone I brag about often back in my home state of Massachusetts. But because our duty on this committee is to live up to the Constitution that you read in your opening remarks, I do not think this is a proud day for this committee. And my colleague and fellow warrior, Mr. Russell, raised in a very eloquent speech numerous examples of military leaders who have proudly served in our civilian government. Most of these are from the past. Most of them, in fact, served at a time when we still had slaves. There are laws that we have passed as a Congress that we ought to abide by. One of those laws was, in fact, the Defense Act of 1947. We have a duty and an obligation not just to live up to the Constitution, but to those laws that we, as a Congress, have passed. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned also in your opening remarks the fact that we are talking about an extraordinary individual. I couldn't agree more with that statement. I served proudly under General Mattis in Iraq in 2003 in the 1st Marine Division. But you also mentioned an extraordinary situation. And I think we all know what that means. And I believe we have a duty on this committee to live up to our private words and concerns with public debate. Fundamentally, that is our job. That is our duty under the Constitution. It is our obligation to the American people and to the men and women who put their lives on the line for that Constitution and for us every single day. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You began this day telling us about the bipartisan commitment of this committee
which should be a record, I think, that is honored. In this discussion, we've heard such words as dishonor, tyranny, threat to the Constitution, democracy, and even a question as whether or not members who support this take seriously their responsibilities to this committee. Well, while all those statements were being made, Representative Bishop next to me pointed out that on C-SPAN 2, the Senate took up the matter of General Mattis and the issues of a waiver, and the vote was overwhelmingly bipartisan at 81-17. So I am going to be very proud to join the overwhelmingly bipartisan group in the Senate that voted in favor of this as we vote in favor of this today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Khanna, did I get that right?
I want to thank you, Chairman Thornberry, and Ranking Member Smith for your leadership in making this one of the House committees that's truly bipartisan. It's an honor to be on the committee. I also want to recognize Congressman Turner, who said this would be a great committee to be on, and thanks for your recommendation. I had the privilege of actually being at Stanford, where General Mattis spent some time. And I was laughing with my legislative aide, Gio, who had him for class and probably has more of an ability to now talk to him than I did. I said, that shows you where freshman members of Congress rank on the totem pole in Washington. But, you know, General Mattis, others have talked of his extraordinary service. I will say at Stanford, he had a reputation of being extraordinarily accessible to students. He talked with tech leaders and others about the future of cybersecurity and what we needed to do as a country. And so my support for Ranking Member Smith in association with his comments has nothing to do with sending a message of disunity, but more a hope that if General Mattis is confirmed, that he will take the same spirit that he had at Stanford, which is being accessible to folks and being accessible to this committee. And I have confidence that he has certainly the vision to modernize the military and to listen to folks. Thank you.
Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's all not forget, H.R. 393, which we have before us, does not mention General Mattis. It just talks about it in broad categories. Let us also not forget that legislatures, Congresses before us felt that it was necessary to have limitations. Whether it began at 10 years and went to 7, the one thing we must not forget is they never did away with it. And there's a reason why. And the reason is because of the fact that there is a basic tenet out there that many of us believe in, that it's the civilian control of the military. And this brings us to General Mattis, because of course we can't have this discussion without that in context. In 2016, General Mattis edited Warriors and Citizens, the American Views of the Military, Hoover Institute Press, and Chapter 11 of that book is one that he authored. It's called Ensuring a Civil-Military Connection. He was very concerned about this very topic. He talked about 40 years of an all-civilian, an all-volunteer military, 15 years of continuous war, and what is that impact on the military? He also kept mentioning the relationships between the civilian society and military has to be strong and has to be healthy. And it has to be based on respect and understanding. He made it a point to say that scholars of civil-military relations are always fixated on the risk of military insubordination to the civilian control. He also says, scholars of civilian-military relations worry inordinately about the prospects of the American military growing resentful of its civilian masters. These are very poignant words in the context of what we are looking at today and what the Senate will do. We are not confirming him. We're not saying, General Mattis, you can't be this if the waiver goes through. We're not saying that. All we're saying is that as the equal house in the United States Congress, we as members of HASC should have had the opportunity to ask him about these thoughts, very thoughtful thoughts. But we need to know, or we have a right to know, what does he mean about the concerns that people have? How does he feel about the 7-year ban and why the waiver should be applicable to him? I think when you look and you read his writings, and he is called warrior monk, he's called mad dog, he's called all these variety of things. We, I believe, deserve the opportunity to hear it directly from him as to what his views are. Because this is a waiver that if people before us, the Congresses before us, thought it wasn't necessary, they could have done away with it. But they didn't. They kept 7 years. They put 10 years. Why? Why? What did they think that we should ignore today? What do we want to ask General Mattis? And like I said, this is not about General Mattis. This is not about whether he can be Secretary of Defense. This is about our rights and what we should be able to ask a gentleman who himself is very concerned about civilian-military relations. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're back.
Ms. Shea Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am concerned that the Trump transition team that made this decision was not elected by the people. And I heard my colleague talking about some of the wonderful men and women sitting here who are serving in Congress, but they were elected. And we were elected also. And it's our responsibility to uphold the Constitution. So I wish that, and I appreciate General Mattis' service. I know him. I have seen him in committee. I think he has been a marvelous public servant and a wonderful general and certainly is capable of doing this job. But he still should have come here, and he was willing to come here. And the Trump transition team that was not elected prevented that. And I'm concerned about that interference here. There is agreement, apparently, on both sides of the aisle that General Mattis should have come here and that he wanted to. And I think that is a really important agreement that we have. But there's another issue that I think I would like to just state for the record, and I've heard some of my colleagues talk about this as well, and that we all love this country. We're on this committee because we take this so seriously, our security. I was a military spouse. I know there's a number of people here who were spouses or served. So I do believe that that is not the issue, that it's a comment on a general. Of course it's not. It's a comment on and a belief about what we need to do and to adhere to the Constitution. And as my colleague said, this could have been changed by other Congresses, and they chose not to. So for us to step into this right now without even hearing General Mattis, I think is not a wise step to take. And my final point here is that when you look at the language, it doesn't even say General Mattis. So for those who are saying, well, let's do this because he's strong, he's been a great leader, he has all these skills, imagine if they decided that it wasn't going to be General Mattis. The way this is written, it could be a second lieutenant, technically, or a first lieutenant without all of that experience, without all of that learned wisdom and all of that warrior experience. And then would we vote differently? So I think we have to take the name out of this bill as we look at it and decide based upon that rather than whether it's General Mattis or not. So I thank you for the chance to have my say about this, Mr. Chairman, but I am going to vote no reluctantly. Thank you.
Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by saying that I have the greatest respect for my colleagues. And despite some of the things that were said, I don't think anyone in this room is afraid of a warrior class or in any way does anything but honor the service of those who put on the uniform. I don't think anyone's an enemy of the Constitution. I don't think the world will end or the Constitution will crumble or our country will fall apart if we move forward with the bill before us. But I do think that an extraordinary request is being made of the House and of this committee. And the most basic, ordinary courtesy is not being provided to this committee to answer our concerns or to hear the testimony of General Mattis directly. And I think that's important. There could be, for me, right now, this week, no greater signal of the incoming administration's belief in the fundamental principle of civilian control of the military than to have General Mattis appear before this committee to answer our questions, to give us his statements, to form the record, as one of my colleagues said. And so, for as much respect as I have for him, and as inclined as I am to support this because of who he is, and because of my profound respect for the chairman of this committee and for my friends on the other side, I think it comes down to what Mr. Courtney said earlier, which when you look at this as a matter of the people, and in this case the person, versus the law, in this country, the law should always triumph. I want to make sure that I and this committee do the right thing. And I tell you, I am compelled by Mr. Byrne's argument that for the men and women who are currently serving in harm's way, it's imperative that we have a Secretary of Defense in place. And I'm also sympathetic to the argument made by Mr. Conaway that we want to do this as a unified body to the degree that we can. It should not be a decision made along partisan lines. And so I think it's important for all of us, and this is my appeal to every single member here, that we move out of this committee unified in disapproving the bill before us, compelling the President-elect to bring Mr. Mattis before us to answer our questions. We can still do that. He, the President-elect, still has the opportunity to do the right thing. It will not prevent him from being able to nominate and place and appoint that Secretary of Defense in time to take care of our service members. But I don't think there's any more awesome responsibility in our Constitution than that is given to us when it comes to sending our men and women into harm's way, many of them who will lose their lives, and many of them who will be asked to take the lives of others. And so I think we should jealously guard our prerogatives and honor our responsibility. And in doing that, I think for this committee, we need to vote no today. We need to compel the President-elect to bring General Mattis before us. And going forward, I think we can, in a unified way, do the best thing for our country, our Constitution, and the men and women who are serving in harm's way around the world. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. You know that I have great respect for this committee, for the chairman, for my colleagues, and quite honestly, even more respect for the record and the service of General Mattis. He is a military hero in our country. I'm going to be voting no today, not because I think that his record isn't a stellar one, but because to me, this is an early indication of how the Trump administration is going to deal with the United States Congress and specifically with the House of Representatives. I think that General Mattis, I think that this vote would go forward and this bill would go forward if we waited a few days and allowed him to come testify. The point has been made that he was very willing to come here and testify before this committee, which I think makes sense because he just did that in the Senate and there was no problem. So the fact that Donald Trump has kept him from coming to testify is even more disturbing. This, to me, is an early indication that Mr. Trump is going to continue to push the boundaries and see how far he can get, basically ignoring the responsibility and the rights of this committee and of this Congress. And I think that there should be an early pushback to let him know that we're going to play our rightful constitutional role. And so today, by going forward with this bill, and when we vote on it tomorrow, on the House floor, I think that he's going to take from that he can essentially do the same on other policy issues. And so I would say that overall it's a bad omen of things to come. I hope that my colleagues who are inclined to support General Mattis because of his stellar record will consider how this will neuter early on this committee and the House of Representatives vis-a-vis the presidency. I yield back, Chairman.
Mr. Veazey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Mattis is a very tremendous warrior, and I have the greatest confidence that he would be a great Secretary of Defense. But the framers of the Constitution were clear in their belief that civilian control of the military is what would be best for our country. In winning freedom from Britain, the framers noticed that the king there controlled the military, and our founding fathers did not want that sort of arrangement here on American lands. I'm already very happy that General Mattis has already shown a streak of independence and speaking out about issues like climate change, his commitment to not use torture, and pushing back against the incoming administration and reaffirming America's role in maintaining our air superiority. I only wish that he would come before the committee and answer questions before us so we could make sure that he is going to keep this independent streak and answer some of these questions and concerns that people have before the House of Representatives. Therefore, I will be voting no, but do think that this man is one of the most tremendous generals that we've had in the history of the United States military. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I can't make the argument any better than Mr. O'Rourke, Mr. Veazey, Mr. Moulton, a number of members have made it as to why it is important that we did have the opportunity to have General Mattis come before us so that we could be sure that this committee gets to do its job. I think those remarks were very well made and on point, as a number of other members were as well. I do want to just briefly apologize to Mr. Byrne. My 1 a.m. comment, I wasn't meant to imply anything. That's just what I'd heard. So you actually made me quite happy to find out that it's going to be a lot earlier than that. I wasn't, I've for years been a legislator, and I always find it interesting that no matter which party it is, when a controversial bill is passed, if it happens to be passed late, it was passed in the dead of night. And therefore, I've never believed that. It doesn't matter whether you pass it at 2 a.m. or 2:30 in the afternoon. It's the same bill. So I didn't mean to imply anything by that. Glad to hear that we are, in fact, going to be meeting earlier. And I guess the last thing I'd say is, I know the remarks about how, it'd be great if we could be unified, and it would. But again, I want to just reference Mr. O'Rourke's remarks. We could be unified. We could be unified in standing up for the responsibility of this committee without harming any of the things that have been said. General Mattis could be sworn in as Secretary of Defense if he simply said, appreciate you saying you're not going to send him. We're not going to vote for this until you do. And it has been told to me that this was some low-level transition person who made the decision not to send him. I'm quite certain that rather quickly he would be made available because, as we've all heard, General Mattis is more than willing to be here. I watched the Senate hearing. I think they got done at 12:30. They got done remarkably quickly for the Senate. We could have heard from him and been done an hour ago. So what we're really asking is that the committee stand up for itself and say, no, you're not going to push us around. We do want to hear from him. And the last remark on that is, it's great that the Senate voted 81-17 in favor of General Mattis. They had the opportunity to do their job as was intended. General Mattis, as I think most of us probably watched on TV, testified before them and answered their questions, not forever. Everybody had 5 minutes, did a good job. They had that chance. So it was a lot easier for them to take that vote. And the last thing is, civilian control of the military is something that has been talked about, and whether it appears in the Constitution or not, it's something that we have long held dear. And as I believe Mr. Moulton made the point, we also uphold the laws. And it is the law that you have to be out of service 7 years in order to serve as Secretary of Defense. And I would add that a number of members of this committee, including Mr. Conaway, actually voted for that 7-year. So if we didn't think it was reasonable when we were amending it from 10 back in, again, I think it was 2008, I forget when, we could have got rid of it. The law was made, and it has a purpose, and I think some of the purposes have been brought out by other members of the committee. So there is actually a reason for it. And if there isn't a reason for it, during any number of the times that the Republicans controlled this body, or they could have got rid of it, or the Democrats for that matter. So all we're asking today is that we uphold the law, and that we uphold the importance of this committee, and that we don't just roll over because somebody in Trump Tower said, nope, we're not going to send him. By the way, I think 24 hours before we had already planned on having him here, it had been noticed by this committee that General Mattis was going to appear before us. He said he was going to appear before us. And then someone just decided, yeah, we don't really want him to. And for no good reason. I mean, General Mattis can handle himself. You watched him testify. I mean, what are we going to do to him? It just would have allowed us to actually do the job that we were elected to do. And so our failure to stand up for that, I think, is a mistake. And that is the reason that I'm going to be opposing this piece of legislation. I yield back, and I do with one final thing. I think this has been an excellent debate, and I want to thank members of both parties for their comments. And I think it proves what the chairman said at the outset. We have outstanding individuals on this committee, and I am privileged to serve with all of you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I agree that there's been good discussion. As I've said a couple times, I agree with many of the points that have been made. Let me just touch briefly on 3 points. As far as the text of the legislation, I think at some point the comment was made that it's open-ended. Y'all have it in front of you. It says the section applies only to the first person appointed. It's got to be not within 3 years, but it could be less than 7. It's clunky, I admit, but everybody who voted for the CR, which on the Democratic side was everybody but Mr. Castro and Mr. Gallego, supported the legislation that said that.
But the gentleman, just a quick point on the CR. We objected to that language. I just want to make it clear. The Democrats objected to that language. We just weren't prepared to shut down the government over it.
No, I understand. Well, I didn't support everything in the CR either.
Exactly.
But my point is
so
that the CR language, imperfect as it is what has dictated what the language in the bill before us and the identical language in the Senate. As I said, I wouldn't have written it that way. But the reason it is the way it is, and it will apply to General Mattis, it will go away. If somebody else wants to do this, then a separate piece of legislation will have to move through Congress. Civilian control has been talked about a lot. I just refer members to the roundtable discussions as well as the testimony that the Senate had earlier this week. There's lots of parts of civilian control of the military. It's not a one string item. And so we're part of that. There's lots of parts of that. And the assessment of everybody who has at least talked to us in the Senate is that all of the civilian control protections are strong enough that they support granting this waiver. Last point, lots of talk about the prerogatives of this committee and the House. A little bit of mention, a lot of mention about executive versus legislative, not nearly as much mention about House versus Senate, which is also an undercurrent here. I just want to remind everybody that the only precedent for this was 1950, and General Marshall did not appear before us or the Senate, and that bill was passed and signed into law. So the idea that we are doing something drastically different from happened in the past, that the Constitution's going to collapse because we're not standing up for ourselves, I think is at odds with the historical record. Now, none of that argues or means that I change my mind. This is a big deal. He should have been able to come up and talk to us. It would have got our relationship off on a good foot. It would have given him a very strong bipartisan vote of support. All of those reasons are absolutely true. And as I said in my opening statement, unfortunately, short-sightedness prevailed. But I do not believe that it is a constitutional crisis for us to follow the example that was done in 1950. If there are no, I'm sorry, one other point, and Mr. BYRNE made it. All of this, the discussion that we've had here is important. But the rest of the story is men and women are risking their lives all around the world. They need a Secretary of Defense. Anything we do other than pass this bill today will mean they do not have a Secretary of Defense on January 20th. And I think it's important for the world, for them, to see that we have General Mattis in place to fulfill that important role on that day. If there's no further discussion without objection, the bill is considered as read for amendment and open for amendment at any point. Are there any amendments to the bill? If not, the chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, for the purpose of a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee adopt the bill H.R. 393 and report it favorably to the House with the recommendation it do pass.
Questions on the motion of the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson. So, members in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman request a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Thornberry.
Aye.
Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Mr. Brady. Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Wilson.
Aye.
Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Lobiondo. Mr. Lobiondo votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Ms. Berdallo. Ms. Berdallo votes no. Mr. Franks. Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Schuster. Mr. Schuster votes aye. Ms. Songas. Ms. Songas votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes no. Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman votes aye. Mr. O'Rourke. Mr. O'Rourke votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mrs. Hanabusa. Mrs. Hanabusa votes no. Mr. Bridenstine. Mr. Bridenstine votes aye. Ms. Shea Porter. Ms. Shea Porter votes no. Dr. Wenstrup. Dr. Wenstrup votes aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. McEachin. Mr. McEachin votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally votes aye. Mrs. Murphy. Mrs. Murphy votes no. Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Castro. Mr. Castro votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Bacon? Aye. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Banks? Aye. Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney votes aye.
Clerk will report the result.
Mr. Chairman, there are 34 aye votes, 28 no votes.
Quorum being present, the motion is adopted, and without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Mr. Brady?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Consistent with House rules, I would like to assert the right of any member to file supplementary, minority, additional, or dissenting views for inclusion in the committee's report to the House on the bill just ordered reported.
Pursuant to Clause 2L of House Rule 11, all members are entitled to not less than 2 calendar days to file such views in writing. I ask unanimous consent staff be allowed to make necessary conforming technical and clerical changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. No further business. The committee stands adjourned.
So the House Armed Services Committee voting 34 to 28 to waive the National Security Act of 1947, allowing retired General James Mattis to be able to be considered for Secretary of Defense, as he was nominated to that post by President-elect Donald Trump. General Mattis retired in 2013, and the current law requires retired military to be out of the service for 7 years. If you missed any of this committee hearing, you'll be able to watch it again at cspan.org. Well, at the end of General Mattis' confirmation hearing this morning, the Senate Armed Services Committee also voted in favor of the waiver. And this afternoon, the full Senate took action on the waiver, approving it on a vote of 81 to 17. The waiver now needs a vote in the full House, which is expected sometime tomorrow. Now on C-SPAN 3, it's today's Senate confirmation hearing for General Mattis as Defense Secretary. The Senate hearing, the Armed Services Committee, is chaired by Senator John McCain.